blood on the cold marble floor. That was my absolute last memory before the darkness took me. I died ruined, stripped of my dignity. All because I spent my entire life cleaning up my cousin's messes. But when I finally opened my eyes, the crystal chandelier above me was intact. My lungs were full of clean air, and Victoria was whining about a ripped seam. I was back. Back to the exact moment that sealed my fate. This time I'm not lifting a single finger. Let her burn. Silk ripping sounds, exactly like a breaking bone. If you listen closely enough, it's a sharp, violent snap that echoes in a quiet room, followed by the sickening hiss of threads giving way. I heard that sound and my eyes snapped open. I wasn't in the sterile, suffocating hospital room anymore. I wasn't listening to the steady, damning beep of a heart monitor counting down my final miserable seconds on Earth. I was standing in the opulent, rose-tinted guest suite of the Whitaker estate. The air smelled of expensive hairspray and crushed peonies. And right in front of me stood Victoria. She was staring at the mirror, her mouth shaped in a perfect horrified O. Her hands were desperately clutching the side of her custom ivory gown. The zipper had caught on the delicate French lace, and in her usual impatient frenzy, she had yanked it hard. The result was a massive, jagged tear running from her ribs all the way down to her hip. "Clara!" she shrieked, her voice drilling straight into my skull. "Clara, do something. Look at what happened." I didn't move. I just stared at my hands. They were smooth. The chemical burns I would suffer 2 years later, after Victoria blamed me for sabotage at the design firm, were completely gone. My fingers weren't calloused from sewing her endless alterations. My breathing was steady. I was me tine again. The sheer impossible reality of it washed over me, heavy and cold. I had died an outcast, a scapegoat, utterly alone. Yet here, I was standing in my cheap navy bridesmaid-style dress, watching the golden child of the family have a meltdown over a piece of fabric. "Are you deaf?" Victoria snapped, spinning around to face me. The tear gaped open, exposing her pale skin and the boning of the corset beneath. "The usher is going to call our names in 20 minutes. Fix it." Now in my past life, this was the exact moment my descent into hell began. Back then, I had panicked alongside her. I loved Victoria. I thought we were sisters in everything but blood. When she cried, my heart broke. I had grabbed the emergency sewing kit. I didn't have matching ivory thread or extra fabric. So, I did the unthinkable. I took the fabric shears, went into the bathroom, and cut a massive, beautiful swath of silk from the lining of my own dress, ruining its structure. I sat on the floor, my fingers flying, bleeding from needle pricks, desperately piecing her gown back together. I missed my own introduction to society. I walked out an hour late, my dress looking like a deflated, lopsided mess. The society matrons whispered about my sloppy appearance, while Victoria walked down those grand stairs looking like an avant-garde angel. The asymmetrical lace pattern I created was praised as a stroke of genius. She took all the credit. She caught the eye of the most powerful families in the room, securing a future that should have been mine, and stepped right on my neck to climb higher. "Clara." Victoria's voice cracked, pulling me sharply back to the present. Real tears were welling in her eyes now. The panic was setting in. "Where is your sewing kit? Get it out." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the selfish curve of her mouth, the arrogant tilt of her chin. I felt the phantom pain in my chest, where my heart had given out from the stress, in public humiliation, she orchestrated years later. I blinked slowly, letting my arms drop completely to my sides. "I don't have it," I said. My voice was incredibly calm. It sounded foreign to my own ears. Victoria froze. "What do you mean, you don't have it? You always have it. You're obsessed with your stupid little needles." "I left it at home," I lied, keeping my expression entirely blank. "I didn't think I would need it tonight. It's a gala. We're supposed to be celebrating, not working." "Are you insane?" She stalked toward me, grabbing my shoulders and shaking me slightly. "Look at my dress. I am the debutante. I am the center of attention tonight. You have to fix this. Rip something off your dress. Use a safety pin, glue it. I don't care. Just fix me." The entitlement was so raw, so violently absurd that a short, bitter laugh escaped my lips. Rip my own dress? I asked, stepping back, so her hands fell away from me. I don't think so. Aunt Margaret would be furious if I ruined the dress she bought for me. My mother cares about me, you idiot. Victoria screamed, her face flushing an ugly shade of red. She bought you that cheap rag so you wouldn't embarrass us. But if I walk out there looking like this, we're both ruined. Find a way to fix it. I tilted my head, studying the tear. It was genuinely awful. Without a proper patch, and at least an hour of careful stitching. The dress was structurally compromised. If she breathed too hard, the corset would pop right through the delicate silk. I'm sorry, Victoria, I said softly, layering my voice with false helplessness. I really am, but I'm not a magician. You pulled it too hard. The fabric is shredded. Even if I had a needle, there's nothing for the thread to grip. You're useless, she sobbed, turning back to the mirror and pulling desperately at the gaping hole. You are absolutely useless. Why do we even keep you around? There it was. The truth she usually kept hidden behind sweet smiles and backhanded compliments. I let the insult wash over me, feeling nothing but cold, hard satisfaction. Maybe you should hold it closed, I suggested mildly, like a pose. It could look intentional. Before she could scream at me again, the heavy oak door of the suite burst open. Aunt Margaret swept into the room like a hurricane in a taffeta dress. She was a woman who commanded space, wearing her wealth like armor. Her sharp eyes immediately scanned the room, bypassing me entirely to land on her weeping daughter. Victoria, darling, what is taking so long? The photographers are ready for the pre-descent portraits, and Margaret stopped dead. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face. What in God's name happened to your gown? It ripped, Victoria wailed, running to her mother. She pointed an accusing finger straight at me. I was just putting it on. And it tore. Clara refuses to fix it. She just stood there and laughed at me. Margaret's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. This was the woman who had taken me in when my parents died. A fact she reminded me of every single day of my miserable life. She didn't view me as a niece. I was an accessory, a charity case meant to boost her social standing. Is this true, Clara? Margaret's voice was dangerously low, a tone that used to make me tremble and apologize profusely. I met her gaze, my spine perfectly straight. I didn't shrink, I didn't look down at my cheap shoes. Victoria was rushing and forced the zipper. I said evenly, sticking to the facts. The lace caught and tore the silk. I didn't laugh at her, Aunt Margaret. But I told her the truth. I don't have my sewing kit, and the fabric is shredded beyond a quick fix. I can't magically weave new silk out of thin air. Don't give me excuses, Margaret snapped, stepping toward me. Her heavy perfume seemed to choke the air out of the room. You want to be a designer, don't you? This is what designers do. They solve problems. Take your dress off. I blinked. Excuse me. You heard me, Margaret demanded, pointing at my navy dress. Take it off. We will cut the back panel out of yours and safety pin it inside Victoria's dress to hold the structure. The colors will clash, but I have a wide silver sash we can wrap around her waist to hide the bulk. Take it off now. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer audacity. In my past life, I had offered my dress willingly. Now she was demanding that I strip in a dressing room and walk out of a society galley in my underwear so her daughter wouldn't suffer the consequences of her own clumsiness. No, I said, the word hung in the air, heavy and solid. Margaret actually stumbled back half a step, as if I had physically struck her. What did you say to me? I said no, I repeated, my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to pound with a fierce, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I will not take my dress off. I will not sit in a closet while Victoria walks down the stairs. You bought me this dress to attend the gala as part of the family. If I don't walk down those stairs, people will ask questions. And I won't lie to them about why I'm missing. You ungrateful little brat, Margaret hissed, her face twisting into something ugly and cruel. After everything I've done for you, we feed you, we house you. And I earn my keep by tailoring Victoria's clothes, doing her homework, and managing this household's schedule. I cut in. I had never interrupted my aunt before. It felt incredible. But he'd draw the line at giving her the clothes off my back because she was careless. The announcer is going to call our names in exactly 5 minutes. You have 2 choices. You can either stand here yelling at me while Victoria misses her cue, or you can find some safety pins and pray for a miracle. A sharp knock on the door interrupted the heavy silence. Mrs. Whittaker, the debutantes are lining up, a muffled voice called from the hallway. Panic returned to Margaret's eyes. She knew she was out of time. She glared at me with a hatred so pure it practically burned, then spun around to the vanity. She began violently yanking open drawers, searching for anything that might salvage the disaster. She found a small emergency tin of safety pins. "Come here, Victoria," Margaret ordered, her voice shaking with rage. For the next 4 minutes, I stood silently in the corner, watching my aunt clumsily try to pin the gaping wound in the dress closed. But Margaret didn't know the first thing about dressmaking. She grabbed large sections of the delicate silk, pulling the fabric entirely off-center. Every pin she drove through the material created a strange, puckered gather. By the time she was done, the side of Victoria's dress looked like a lumpy metallic spine. It threw off the entire silhouette of the gown. "It looks awful," Victoria whispered, staring at the mirror as fresh tears ruined her mascara. "Hold your arm firmly against your side," Margaret commanded, smoothing Victoria's hair with a trembling hand. "Do not lift your right arm. Keep a wide smile. The lighting is dim on the stairs. No one will notice if you sell it with confidence." It was a lie, and they both knew it. High society noticed everything. They thrived on it. The door opened, and the event coordinator waved us out. It was time. We walked down the long, carpeted corridor toward the grand balcony overlooking the ballroom. My heart was completely calm. I walked with my head held high, the cheap navy fabric of my dress flowing smoothly around my legs. Behind me, Victoria walked stiffly, terrified to breathe, her right arm pinned awkwardly to her side. "Miss Clara Whittaker." The announcer's voice boomed over the microphone. The classical music swelled. I stepped out onto the top of the grand staircase. The ballroom below was a sea of glittering diamonds, sharp tuxedos, and judging eyes. I didn't rush. I descended the stairs with perfect, measured grace, a small, polite smile on my face. A few polite claps echoed, but mostly murmurs of mild approval. I reached the bottom and stepped to the side, turning back to watch the balcony. And now, presenting our star debutante, Miss Victoria Whittaker, Victoria stepped into the light. She looked terrified. She took her first step down, then the second, and then disaster struck. In her stiff, unnatural posture, she misjudged the height of the third step. Her heel caught the heavy hem of her gown. She jerked forward to catch her balance, and her right arm instinctively flew up to grab the banister. The sound of the safety pins popping out of the delicate silk echoed over the microphone like a series of tiny firecrackers. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like a sudden violent shift in atmospheric pressure. One safety pin gave way, then another, and another. The kinetic force of Victoria lunging for the heavy oak banister, combined with her frantic, flailing movement, ripped the remaining flimsy anchor points clean out of the delicate silk. The jagged tear I had refused to mend split wide open. The entire right side of her custom ivory gown collapsed in a spectacular failure of structural integrity. Fabric pulled awkwardly around her hips. The rigid boning of her corset jutted out against her pale skin, fully exposed beneath the chandelier's glaring light. She stood frozen on the fifth step, her right arm still extended in a desperate grasp. Silence crashed down over the room. The string quartet in the corner faltered, a single cello dragging out a grotesque, squeaking note before the musician stopped in shock. 500 pairs of eyes stared up at the Whittaker family's golden child, now half undressed and looking like a shipwreck on the grand staircase. "Oh dear heavens," murmured a raspy, dry voice to my immediate left. It belonged to Mrs. Ashford, a sharp-featured matriarch whose silent approval dictated the social and financial calendar of the entire eastern seaboard. She raised a silver lorgnette to her eyes and scrutinized Victoria's exposed undergarments with clinical detachment. Is that duct tape? No safety pins. How incredibly vulgar. It looks like a back alley alteration. Heat flushed Victoria's face, turning her cheeks a violent, blotchy red that clashed horribly with her pale lipstick. She looked down at herself. The sheer terror pooling in her wide eyes was almost palpable from where I stood. In my past life, I would have been rushing up those steps right at this very second. I would have thrown my own shawl around her shoulders, shielding her from the predatory gaze of the crowd. I would have whispered that everything was okay, taking the blame entirely on my own shoulders, telling everyone loud enough to hear that I had failed to secure the clasp properly. Not tonight. I stayed firmly rooted to the polished marble floor. I watched. Victoria let out a high, thin sob that carried painfully over the microphone. She turned, tangling her expensive heels in the ruined silk again, and began to scramble back up the stairs. She looked like a frightened, clumsy animal, fleeing a predator, stripped of all the grace she had practiced for months. Aunt Margaret rushed out to the top of the landing to meet her, aggressively attempting to wrap her arms around Victoria and hide the massive tear. But the angle was incredibly awkward. They collided. Margaret's hip slammed into a marble pedestal, knocking a massive 6-foot floral arrangement over the edge. Glass shattered violently onto the steps below, sending water and crushed white roses cascading down the stairs. The murmurs erupted into a deafening roar of gossip. Did you see the stitching? Utterly barbaric. I heard the Whiteacres were having severe liquidity issues. Do you suppose they bought her gown off the rack and tried to take it out themselves? Margaret always acts so incredibly superior. Look at them scrambling like wet hens. I stood perfectly still, letting the venomous whispers wash over me. It felt like standing under a warm shower. This was the exact society Victoria and Margaret worshipped. These were the people they continually sacrificed my happiness, my time, and eventually my life to appease. They were sharks, and the moment there was a single drop of blood in the water, they turned on their own without a moment's hesitation. A rather catastrophic debut, wouldn't you say? A deep, quiet voice broke through my cold reverie. I turned to see Adrian, standing beside me. He was the eldest son of the Sterling family, an old money dynasty that practically owned the city shipping ports. In my previous life, Adrian hadn't spoken a single word to me tonight. Back then, he had been completely captivated by Victoria's supposedly avant-garde dress and her radiant confidence, completely unaware that her success was built on my ruined fingers. He eventually became her primary sponsor, opening doors that led to her domination of the social hierarchy while I was locked away in the design basement. Tonight, he wasn't looking at the staircase. He was looking directly at me. It's unfortunate, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. I didn't smile. Gloating would make me look petty and small. I needed to appear like the poised, sensible counterpart to the upstairs circus. Accidents happen. Adrian raised an eyebrow and took a slow sip from his heavy crystal tumbler. His sharp, piercing gray eyes analyzed my face. Accidents usually happen backstage in a dressing room. Walking into the spotlight like that requires a certain level of desperation or sheer arrogance. Perhaps a bit of both, I offered quietly, refusing to elaborate. He let out a low, appreciative hum. You didn't run up there to help her. I'm afraid I wouldn't have been much use. I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I don't have any safety pins. A genuine, unexpected laugh escaped Adrian's lips. It was a rich, warm sound that made a few heavily jeweled heads turn in our direction. He quickly masked it behind a polite cough, but the sharp amusement in his eyes remained. Pragmatic. I like that. Clara, isn't it? Yes. Well, Clara, Adrian murmured, leaning in slightly, so only I could hear his gravelly tone over the rising din of the ballroom. I suspect the rest of this evening is going to be incredibly tedious for your family. But you seem entirely unbothered. Before I could formulate a response to his dangerous observation, the heavy double doors at the top of the stairs slammed shut, cutting off Victoria's hysterical wailing. The event coordinator, a small, profusely sweating man named Mr. Pembroke, practically sprinted to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, a minor wardrobe malfunction. Absolutely nothing to worry about. Please enjoy the champagne in the raw bar. The orchestra will resume momentarily." The music started up again, a desperate, upbeat waltz that felt entirely out of place in the wake of the disaster. The crowd slowly dispersed from the base of the stairs, forming tight, whispering clusters. The damage was permanently done. Victoria Whittaker was no longer the season's premier debutante. She was the punchline of a joke that would last for years. I looked down at my simple, cheap navy dress. It was perfectly intact. I was breathing easily. The phantom weight on my chest, the crushing anxiety that used to define my existence, was entirely gone. I took a glass of champagne from a passing silver tray. It tasted like absolute victory. 10 minutes later, one of the estate staff tapped me nervously on the shoulder. "Miss Clara, your aunt is demanding your presence in the upstairs dressing suite immediately. She is quite upset." I handed my empty champagne flute back to the waiter. "Thank you, Henry. I'll go right up." I didn't rush. I climbed the grand staircase at a leisurely pace, stepping carefully around the shards of shattered glass and crushed white roses still littering the marble. This was the physical evidence of Victoria's panic attack. I memorized the sight, locking it away in my mind to keep myself warm when the coming winner of their inevitable abuse tried to freeze me out. Pushing open the heavy oak door to the suite, the smell of burnt hairstyling tools and sour anxiety hit me like a physical wall. Victoria was curled into a tight ball on the velvet chaise lounge, sobbing so hard that her shoulders shook with violent hiccups. The ruined silk dress lay discarded on the floor, like a dead, flayed animal. She was wrapped in a plush robe, but without her makeup and arrogance, she looked tiny and pathetic. Margaret paced the length of the room, gripping a glass of straight vodka in one shaking hand. When she heard the door latch click shut, she whipped around. Her eyes were bloodshot, and the carefully applied concealer was smudged beneath her lower lashes. "You," she spat, her voice stripped of its usual refined, aristocratic veneer. "You did this." I stood comfortably near the door, my hands folded neatly in front of me. "Did what, Aunt Margaret? Don't play stupid with me." She hurled the heavy crystal glass directly at the wall. It shattered inches from my head, spraying sharp fragments and alcohol across the custom wallpaper. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just watched the liquid drip down the expensive silk panels. "You sabotaged her dress. You must have." There is no other explanation for why that seam gave way so violently. "Mother, my life is over," Victoria wailed, burying her face deeper into the embroidered cushions. "Mrs. Ashford saw my shapewear." Adrian Sterling laughed. I heard him laugh from the balcony. "Quiet, Victoria. I am handling this," Margaret snapped, stalking toward me. She stopped just inches away. Her breath was hot and reeking of liquor. "You were jealous. You've always been jealous of her beauty. You altered the seam to make it weak, didn't you? You set her up to fail in front of everyone." The accusation was so predictable that I had to suppress a smile. In my past life, this was exactly how they operated. Whenever Victoria failed a test, missed a crucial appointment, or caused a scandal, it somehow became my fault for not anticipating and preventing it. I had spent years absorbing their toxic blame, internalizing it until I genuinely believed I was worthless. I didn't touch her dress. I stated calmly, looking directly into Margaret's furious, bloodshot eyes. "I haven't laid a finger on that gown since it arrived from the boutique in Paris." Victoria tore it herself by forcing the zipper in a temper tantrum. "You both know that, liar." Victoria screamed, suddenly sitting up. Her face was swollen, and her eyes were feral with misplaced rage. "You hid your sewing kit. You refused to help me. You wanted me to look like a fool." "I didn't have my kit," I repeated, the lie flowing off my tongue as easily as breathing. "And even if I did, what happened out there wasn't a failure of thread. It was a catastrophic failure of your mother's safety pins. You tripped, Victoria. You panicked and yanked your arm out of position. No seam in the world would have held against that amount of force." Margaret raised her hand, her palm open, aiming a vicious slap at my left cheek. I didn't cower. I didn't brace for impact like a frightened dog. I simply reached up and caught her wrist in midair. Her momentum stopped dead. Margaret gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock. I had never fought back before. My grip was ironclad, fueled by a decade of suppressed rage and the cold knowledge of exactly what this woman was capable of doing to me. "Don't ever try to hit me again," I whispered. My voice was barely more than a breath, but it carried a razor-sharp edge that made her flinch backward. I slowly lowered her arm and released her wrist, then stepped back to smooth an invisible wrinkle from my skirt. "You ungrateful wretch," Margaret stammered, rubbing her arm as if my touch had burned her skin. "My husband will hear about this behavior. Edward will throw you into the street before morning. Uncle Edward will be far more concerned about his company's stock taking a massive hit tomorrow morning when the society papers report his daughter's disastrous debut," I countered smoothly, weaponizing the only thing that mattered to the Whitaker patriarch. "He spent $500,000 on this gala to impress international investors. Instead, you sent his daughter out looking like a ragged patchwork quilt. If you want to point fingers when he asks what happened, I strongly suggest that you practice your defense, because a Clara wouldn't give up her cheap dress is going to sound pathetic to a board of directors." Margaret's jaw snapped shut. All the color drained from her face as the harsh reality of my words sank in. Edward Whitaker was not a forgiving man. He cared about one thing, the bottom line. And tonight, Victoria had become a massive, humiliating liability. "You're a monster," Victoria whispered from the couch, staring at me as if I had suddenly grown horns. "I'm just a guest," I replied lightly. I turned toward the door, my hand resting firmly on the heavy brass handle. "I believe I'll return to the party. Now, someone has to represent the Whitaker family with a shred of dignity tonight. Have a pleasant evening, Victoria. Try some ice for the swelling." I walked out, closing the door firmly behind me. The hallway was quiet, the thick wood muting the sounds of Victoria's renewed hysterics. I let out a long, slow breath. The air in my lungs tasted sweeter than it had in a lifetime. I had survived the first night of my new reality. But the war had only just begun. They would retaliate. They would try to crush me to hide their own embarrassing failures. Let them try. I knew all their dirty secrets now. I knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. And this time, I held the shovel. Stepping back into the ballroom felt entirely different. I wasn't hugging the walls, desperately trying to blend into the velvet drapery to avoid outshining Victoria. I walked straight to the center of the room. The orchestra was playing a frantic, upbeat tempo, trying to scrub the memory of the disaster from the air. It wasn't working. The whispers followed me like a physical wake. Eyes darted toward my navy dress, assessing my calm demeanor and dissecting my lack of visible distress. I caught a few sympathetic glances from the older society wives. Women who knew exactly what it meant to be the collateral damage of a panicked mother. I ordered a club soda with lime from the bar. As the bartender handed me the crystal glass, a heavy masculine hand came down on the mahogany counter beside me. I heard the screaming from the hallway. Adrian Sterling murmured, leaning his tall frame against the bar. He wasn't looking at me. He was watching the crowd with a bored, detached expression on his aristocratic face. Margaret sounded like she was trying to exorcise a demon. She was just expressing her maternal concern. I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of my drink. The acoustics in the guest wing are notoriously unforgiving. Adrian finally turned his head, those piercing gray eyes locking onto mine. There was a dangerous level of intelligence there. In my previous life, I had mistaken his quiet observation for shyness. I had been an idiot. Adrian didn't miss a single detail. He collected leverage the way other men collected luxury cars. "You're very good at saying absolutely nothing while answering the question perfectly," he noted, his voice dropping an octave. "Most girls in your position would be crying in the bathroom right now, terrified of the social fallout. I have nothing to be terrified of, Mr. Sterling. My dress is perfectly intact, He let out a short, sharp breath through his nose, a laugh he refused to release fully. Call me Adrian. And you're right, you survived the wreckage unscathed. But your uncle just walked through the front doors. He was delayed at a board meeting. He doesn't know what happened yet. My stomach tightened instinctively, a phantom reflex from years of enduring Edward Whittaker's explosive temper. I looked past Adrian's shoulder. Edward was handing his tailored cashmere coat to the coat check attendant. He was a large man, built like a retired linebacker, with a red flush in his cheeks from expensive scotch and chronic high blood pressure. He was smiling and shaking hands with a junior partner from a rival firm. Then the junior partner leaned in and whispered something. Edward's smile didn't fade, but it froze. The genial warmth drained from his eyes, leaving behind flat, dead glass. He nodded sharply, patted the man on the shoulder, and began scanning the room. His gaze bypassed the empty grand staircase, skipped over the floral debris, and landed directly on me. Excuse me, I told Adrian, setting down my glass. Duty calls. Good luck, Clara, Adrian murmured. Try not to bleed on the marble. I walked toward my uncle, meeting him halfway, near a quiet alcove shielded by heavy potted ferns. The moment we were out of direct sight of the main floor, his terrifyingly calm facade cracked. Where is your aunt? Edward demanded. He didn't yell. He never yelled in public. His voice was a harsh, scraping whisper that promised absolute hell. And why is everyone in this room talking about my daughter's underwear? Aunt Margaret is upstairs in the dressing suite with Victoria. I answered immediately, keeping my voice low and purely factual. There was a wardrobe malfunction before the descent. The zipper caught, and Victoria tore the side seam of her gown, a tear. Edward's jaw flexed. Women tear dresses all the time. You pin them and move on. You don't put on a burlesque show on my dime. Aunt Margaret attempted to pin it, Uncle Edward. I advised against it because the silk was shredded and the pins lacked a solid anchor. Victoria tripped on the third step. The force pulled the pins loose, and the gown failed structurally. I watched his mind work. Edward was a ruthless businessman. He processed data, identified failure points, and calculated liability. I was giving him exactly what he needed. A timeline, the people involved, and the root cause. I removed all emotion from the equation. Where were you? He asked, his eyes narrowing into hostile slits. You do all that sewing nonsense. Why didn't you fix it? I was not permitted to carry my sewing kit tonight. Aunt Margaret insisted it was inappropriate for a guest at the gala to carry tailoring supplies. She wanted me to look the part of a Whittaker. I delivered the lie seamlessly, framing it as compliance with his wife's vanity. When the tear occurred, Aunt Margaret demanded that I take off my dress so she could use it as a patch. I refused. Edward paused. She asked you to strip in the hallway. She did. I held his gaze without blinking. I refused, because I knew that if I disappeared from the event, the board members' wives would ask questions. I decided it was more important to represent this family with dignity down here than to hide in a closet. Edward stared at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something other than contempt in his eyes. I saw cold, hard calculation. He recognized the brutal pragmatism in my choice. I had protected my own image, which in turn protected a fraction of his. Stay down here, Edward finally ordered, adjusting his silk tie with a jerky, angry motion, smile. If anyone asks, Victoria suffered a mild panic attack and tripped. Control the narrative. Of course, Uncle Edward. He turned and marched toward the staircase. His heavy footsteps echoed like a ticking clock. The executioner was on his way upstairs. I picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray and finally allowed myself a small, razor-thin smile. Morning light in the Whittaker dining room was always harsh. The massive bay windows faced east, flooding the long mahogany table with blinding, unmerciful sunshine. It illuminated every speck of dust in the air and every flaw on the human face. I sat in my usual place, near the end of the table, quietly buttering a piece of dry toast. The house was silent. Even the kitchen staff were walking on eggshells, communicating through terrified hand gestures. At exactly 8, Edward entered. He didn't say a word. He sat at the head of the table, snapped open the morning edition of the Chronicle, and laid it flat beside his black coffee. The front page photograph took up half the sheet. It was a grainy, high-contrast shot taken by a guest leaning over the balcony. It captured Victoria frozen in her moment of disaster, her face twisted in horror, her arm clinging to the banister, and the safety pins gleaming beneath the chandelier as the heavy ivory silk pulled humiliatingly around her thighs. The headline read, "A pinned-up debut, Whitaker heiress unravels at high society gala." The dining room doors opened again. Margaret and Victoria walked in. They looked hollowed out. Victoria's eyes were swollen almost shut, and her skin was splotchy and pale without her expensive creams. Margaret looked 10 years older, her posture rigid, and her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. They sat down. No one touched the silver breakfast cloches. 2%, Edward said to the newspaper without looking up. That is how much Whitaker Industries stock dropped at the opening bell this morning. My major investors are exchanging emails asking whether I am facing sudden bankruptcy. They want to know why I can't afford to buy my daughter a dress that stays intact. Edward, please, Margaret began, her voice trembling. It wasn't our fault. The dress was defective. Defective? Edward finally looked up, his eyes locking onto his wife with terrifying intensity. Mrs. Ashford called my office this morning. She informed my secretary that she will be removing Victoria from the charity cotillion roster. She said, and I quote, "The Whitakers clearly lack the refinement necessary for public representation." Victoria let out a choked sob and buried her face in her hands. The cotillion was the crown jewel of the season. Being removed was a social death sentence. "It's Clara's fault," Victoria wailed, pointing a shaking finger at me from across the table. "She planned this, she hates me. She deliberately weakened the fabric, so it would rip. And then, she refused to help me fix it. She stood there and watched me get ruined." In my past life, this was the exact moment the trap snapped shut. They had screamed, I had cried, and Edward had banished me to the basement annex, effectively making me an unpaid servant for the rest of my miserable existence. I took a slow bite of toast. The crunch echoed loudly in the quiet room. I swallowed, wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, and looked directly at my uncle. "Uncle Edward, may I speak?" Edward's gaze slid toward me. "Make it quick." "Victoria claims I weakened the fabric," I said calmly, resting my hands on the table. "The dress was delivered by courier yesterday at 3 in the afternoon. It was taken immediately into Victoria's locked, private suite. I was downstairs in the conservatory coordinating the florist deliveries until 6. The estate security cameras in the main hallway will confirm that I never went upstairs until it was time to get dressed." Margaret's face went completely slack. She hadn't thought about the cameras. In their rush to find a scapegoat, they had forgotten the basic logistics of their own high-tech security system. Furthermore, I continued, my voice steady and devoid of emotion, when the zipper jammed, Victoria pulled the fabric violently. The tear was not on the seam. The silk itself ripped horizontally across the bias. You cannot sabotage the middle of a fabric panel with a needle and thread. I suggest you examine the dress. The physical evidence will speak for itself. Edward turned his heavy, silent stare toward his wife. "Is the tear on the seam, Margaret?" Margaret swallowed hard. She looked at Victoria, then back at her husband. She was trapped, and she knew it. It tore through the fabric, but Edward, Clara, refused to help. Clara as an 18-year-old girl, not a structural engineer. Edward slammed his fist down on the table. The coffee cups rattled violently in their saucers. Victoria flinched so hard that she nearly fell out of her chair. "You used safety pins. You sent my daughter in front of the wealthiest families in the state, held together by cheap metal and duct tape. You panicked like a common fool, and you made this family look like beggars." "I was trying to save the debut," Margaret cried, tears spilling through her mascara. "You ruined it," Edward snarled. He stood, throwing the newspaper onto Victoria's empty plate. "You are done for the season, Victoria." You will not attend the Sterling yacht party next weekend. You will not attend the museum gala. You will stay in this house, away from the cameras, until the news cycle forgets your face. Dad, no. Victoria shrieked, sheer panic hijacking her voice. You can't do that. Adrian Sterling invited me personally. If I don't go, everyone will say I'm hiding. They'll say I'm a coward. You are hiding, Edward stated coldly. Every time you step in front of a camera, right now, you cost me money. Margaret cut her credit cards. If she wants clothes, she can wear what's already in her closet. He turned on his heel and marched out of the dining room. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, rattling the hinges. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victoria sat staring at the newspaper, her chest heaving as the reality of her social exile washed over her. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white, staring blankly at the wall. I quietly picked up my coffee cup, took a sip, and let the bitter, rich taste coat my tongue. The golden child was locked in the tower, grounded by the very man she used to weaponize against me. I looked at Victoria's ruined, tear-stained face. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I simply felt ready for the next round. 3 days passed in suffocating, glorious quiet. The Wetacre estate felt like a tomb, and I was the only person inside it who was still breathing. Victoria refused to leave her bedroom. Her meals were left on a silver tray outside her door by terrified maids, only to be dragged inside and returned hours later, completely untouched. Margaret spent her waking hours locked in her private study, aggressively dialing society matrons, who were suddenly, inexplicably out of town or away from their phones. The social freeze-out was absolute. In high society, failure was a contagious disease, and no one wanted to catch the Whiteacre rot. I spent my time in the basement annex. In my past life, this damp, dimly lit room had been my prison. It was where I had been banished to hem Victoria's endless wardrobe additions, my fingers cramping beneath a single harsh bulb. Now it was my sanctuary. I unlocked the heavy wooden trunk at the foot of my narrow bed. Inside lay 3 yards of dead-stock midnight blue velvet that I had purchased months ago with my meager allowance. I had originally intended to use it to line a winter cloak for Victoria. Instead, I pulled the heavy, luxurious fabric into my lap and felt the soft pile against my skin. I laid it out on my cutting table. For the first time in 18 years, I picked up my fabric shears with an entirely selfish intention. I was going to build my own armor. I didn't use a pattern. I knew my measurements perfectly. I drafted the lines directly onto the backing of the velvet with a stick of white tailor's chalk, my hands moving with muscle memory and fierce focus. I cut the panels with clean, brutal strokes. Then I sat at the vintage Singer sewing machine. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the needle echoed through the quiet basement like a heartbeat. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't panicked. I constructed a gown with a severe architectural neckline and a draped skirt that moved like liquid shadow. It was entirely unadorned, relying on the flawless cut and richness of the fabric. It was the exact opposite of Victoria's chaotic, over-embellished aesthetic. On Thursday afternoon, the heavy silence of the house was finally broken. I was in the kitchen pouring a glass of iced tea when the front doorbell chimed. A moment later, the head butler, Mother Hale, walked into the kitchen holding a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with dark green wax. The sterling crest was pressed into the center. "For you, Miss Clara," Hale said, his voice entirely neutral, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. I set down my glass, my pulse accelerating just a fraction. I slid my thumb beneath the wax seal and popped it cleanly. The message on the heavy cardstock was brief, elegantly calligraphed, and devastatingly clear. "Miss Clara Wetacre, your presence is formally requested at the Sterling Summer Solstice Yacht Reception this Saturday evening, boarding at Pair 4. I stared at the black ink. Adrian hadn't just noticed me at the gala. He had actively circumvented the Wetacre family hierarchy. He had sent an invitation directly to the niece, completely ignoring the disgraced daughter. "What is that?" A sharp, nasal voice cut through the air. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, her eyes locked on the heavy card stock in my hands. She practically vibrated with nervous energy. Her silk blouse wrinkled as though she hadn't slept in days. "Mail," I said, sliding the invitation back into the envelope. She crossed the kitchen floor in 3 long strides and snatched it from my hand. I let her take it. Fighting her physically would ruin the psychological impact. Margaret pulled out the card. I watched her eyes scan the elegant handwriting. Her face went slack, cycling rapidly from confusion to disbelief to boiling rage. She crushed the thick card stock in her fist, her knuckles turning white. "You little snake," she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "How did you do this? Who did you sleep with to get a sterling invitation while my daughter sits upstairs crying her eyes out?" "I didn't do anything, Aunt Margaret," I replied smoothly, leaning back against the granite counter. "Adrian Sterling spoke to me briefly at the gala. He must have decided I would be an acceptable guest." "Acceptable?" Margaret barked out a harsh, ugly laugh. "You are a charity case. You are a nobody. You will not attend this party. I am calling Adrian's mother immediately to correct this clerical error. You are staying right here in the basement where you belong." "Put the phone down, Margaret." We both froze. Edward stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the hall. He was holding his leather briefcase, having just returned from the city. His face was unreadable as he stared at his wife. "Edward, look at this," Margaret demanded, waving the crumpled invitation at him. "Adrian Sterling invited Clara to the yacht party. Not Victoria, Clara, it's a blatant insult. They are mocking us." Edward walked forward and gently took the crushed paper from Margaret's shaking hand. He smoothed it out on the counter, his eyes scanning the words. He didn't look angry. He looked calculating. "It isn't a clerical error," Edward stated flatly. "Adrian manages his own guest list. The Sterlings control the shipping lanes I desperately need for our European expansion next quarter. I have been trying to get a meeting with Adrian's father for 6 months. Then call him and tell him Victoria will be attending in Clara's place." Margaret pleaded, desperation leaking into her voice. "Edward, if Victoria doesn't go to this party, her season is officially dead. She will be a pariah." "She is already a pariah," Edward snapped, his voice dropping into that terrifying, icy register. "She made herself a laughingstock in front of half the state. If I force Adrian to take Victoria, he will see it as a desperate power play by a failing company. But if Clara goes..." Edward turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He was evaluating me. He saw the cheap clothes, the quiet demeanor, and the perfect composure I had maintained since the gala. He saw a pawn he could actually use. "Clara goes," Edward decided, turning away from Margaret. "She represents the family, she smiles, she shakes hands, and she proves that the Whitakers are not entirely compromised by incompetence." "You cannot do this to our daughter," Margaret screamed, her composure shattering. "I am running a business, Margaret, not a nursery," Edward roared back, silencing her instantly. He looked at me. "Do you have something appropriate to wear? If you show up looking like a street urchin, I will throw you out of this house myself." "I have it handled, Uncle Edward," I said quietly. "Good, don't embarrass me." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving Margaret staring at me with a hatred so pure that it seemed to burn a hole through the floor. I picked up my glass of iced tea, took a sip, and smiled. Salt water and expensive champagne. That was what absolute freedom smelled like. The Sterling yacht was a floating palace of sleek, white fiberglass and polished teak, docked at Pier 4. String lights stretched across the upper decks, casting a warm, golden glow over the 300 guests mingling near the stern. Jazz music drifted over the water, sophisticated and smooth, masking the sounds of the bustling city behind us. I handed my boarding pass to the security detail at the base of the gangway. The guard, a massive man in a tailored dark suit, scanned my name, unclipped the velvet rope, and gave me a curt nod. I walked up the ramp. I wasn't wearing cheap navy polyester tonight. The midnight blue velvet gown moved beautifully in the ocean breeze, its heavy fabric sweeping just inches above the deck. The severe, architectural neckline framed my collarbones perfectly. I had pulled my hair back into a sleek low knot, and wore no jewelry except a pair of simple pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. I didn't need sequins or heavy lace to announce my presence. The tailoring did all the talking. As I stepped onto the main deck, the conversations nearest me naturally paused and heads turned. I felt the familiar, analyzing weight of high society's gaze. But this time I didn't shrink. I kept my chin parallel to the deck and my expression politely aloof. I have to admit, I didn't think you would actually show up. I turned. Adrian Sterling was leaning against the polished mahogany railing, holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit with no tie and looked effortlessly commanding. His piercing gray eyes swept over me, starting at the hem of the velvet dress and slowly rising to meet my gaze. A genuine look of surprise and appreciation flickered across his face, and missed the opportunity to enjoy the ocean air. I asked, stepping closer to the railing. That would be incredibly ungrateful of me. Your uncle allowed this. Adrian asked, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. I expected a rather aggressive phone call from Margaret, demanding that I swap the names on the list. She tried, I admitted truthfully, resting my hands lightly on the teak rail. My uncle overruled her. He believes my presence here proves the Whittaker family still possesses a shred of quiet dignity. Adrian let out a low laugh. He's a ruthless pragmatist. I respect that. And I have to ask, who designed your gown? I know every major fashion house my mother patronizes, and I don't recognize that cut. It's far too severe for the current season, but it works flawlessly. I made it, I said softly. Adrian paused, his glass hovering inches from his mouth. Really? He looked at me, dissecting the information. You sewed this yourself. I designed it, drafted it, and sewed it, I confirmed. I enjoy the structural mechanics of clothing. It's a useful skill. Fascinating, he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with sudden, intense focus. You know, Clara, you are proving to be entirely different from the narrative your family sells about you. Before he could elaborate on that dangerous observation, a sharp, frantic shout echoed from the base of the gangway. Let go of me, you have no right to touch me. Do you know who my father is? The jazz quartet faltered. The polite murmuring on the deck ceased instantly. Every guest turned toward the boarding ramp. Standing on the dock, physically struggling against two massive security guards, was Victoria. She looked completely unhinged. She wore a hot pink, heavily sequined cocktail dress that was completely inappropriate for an elegant evening reception. Her hair was a tangled mass of frantic curls, and her makeup had been applied with a heavy, desperate hand. She was trying to force her way past the velvet rope, her designer heels slipping on the wooden planks. Miss, your name is not on the manifest, the security guard stated loudly, holding her back with one massive arm. I must ask you to leave the pier. Adrian invited me. Victoria shrieked, pointing wildly toward the upper deck, her voice cracking over the sound of the ocean. He invited the Whittaker family. That's me. I'm the Whittaker daughter. That girl standing up there is a fraud. She stole my invitation. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Ashford, standing near the raw bar, audibly scoffed and turned her back on the spectacle in sheer disgust. I stood frozen beside Adrian, watching the destruction of Victoria's social life unfold in real time. She hadn't merely snuck out. She had completely lost her grip on reality. In her desperate need for validation, she had driven herself into a public humiliation far worse than a torn dress. Adrian sighed and set his heavy crystal glass on a passing waiter's tray. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He stepped to the edge of the railing and gazed down at the struggling girl on the dock. Security, Adrian called, his voice booming across the water and cutting through Victoria's hysterical screams with effortless authority. Remove her from the marina. If she resists, call the local authorities for trespassing. Victoria stopped struggling. She looked up at Adrian, her jaw dropping in horror as his words registered. Adrian, no, it's me, Victoria. I know exactly who you are, Miss Whittaker, Adrian stated coldly, his voice carrying across the silent deck. And you are not on my guest list. escort her out. The guards didn't hesitate. They gripped Victoria by both arms, physically lifting her off her feet, and began dragging her back down the pier toward the parking lot. Her screams echoed into the night air, high and desperate, until they finally faded into the distance. Adrian turned back to me, casually adjusting his cuffs. Now, he said, as if a feral girl hadn't just been dragged off his property. Tell me more about the structural mechanics of Velvet. Jazz music immediately swelled back over the upper deck, seamlessly swallowing the ugly silence. High society possessed an incredible, terrifying ability to erase anything unpleasant from their collective memory. Victoria was already a ghost. Adrian didn't mention the incident again. Instead, he spent the next hour dissecting my knowledge of garment construction. He asked piercing questions about supply chains, tensile strength, and the brutal economics of custom tailoring. I answered with the sharp, hard-earned knowledge of a woman who had spent a lifetime doing the unpaid labor of an entire design house. When the yacht finally returned to the pier, Adrian walked me to the base of the gangway. He pulled out a sleek matte black business card, pressing it firmly into my palm. My family owns a controlling stake in the Vanguard Design Institute, he said quietly. The salty breeze caught his sharp lapels. The board is always looking for ruthless, hungry talent. Call the number on the back on Monday. Tell them I sent you. Don't waste your life hemming your aunt's table linens, Clara. I looked down at the golden ticket handed to me by the very man who had unwittingly orchestrated my demise in another lifetime. Thank you, Adrian. Don't thank me. I expect a healthy return on my investment. The drive back was quiet. I fully expected the Whitaker estate to be dark, locked tight in its misery. Instead, it blazed with light from every window. I pushed the front door open. The silence inside was thick with the metallic tang of unadulterated rage. In the study, Edward's guttural bark echoed from the east wing. I stepped into the mahogany-paneled room. It looked like the aftermath of a localized hurricane. Books were swept violently off the desk. Crystal decanters smashed against the fireplace grate. Margaret sat rigidly in a leather armchair, staring blankly at the wall, entirely broken. Edward stood by the window, his massive chest heaving, his expensive silk tie ripped off. Where is she? I asked evenly. Sedated, Edward snarled, pacing toward his ruined desk. She had a full psychotic break in the parking lot. I had to pay the precinct captain $2 in cash just to keep her name off the morning arrest ledger. She is permanently exiled. He looked at me, his eyes running over the flawless velvet gown, assessing me with a cold, predatory hunger. Ashford sent me a text. She praised your composure tonight. She said, "You have the steel this family lacks." I knew exactly where his mind was going. Starting tomorrow, you are moving into the East Wing suite, Edward ordered, pointing a thick finger at my chest. You will attend the charity luncheons. You will court the Sterling boy. You are going to step into Victoria's shoes and fix the damage she caused. In my past life, this demand would have been a dream come true. Validation bought with obedience. I looked at the man who had stolen my childhood and treated me like a stray dog until I became useful to his bottom line. No, I said. The word dropped like a lead weight. Edward blinked as his mental gears seemed to stall. I am not stepping into Victoria's shoes. And I am not fixing your public relations crisis. Margaret snapped out of her catatonic state. You insolent brat. He is offering you the world. I am leaving, I stated. I reached into the hidden pocket of my skirt, pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, and placed it on his desk. Edward stared at it. What is this? A routing number, I said, watching the color drain from his face. A Cayman Islands offshore, holding account, specifically the one where you've been funneling the profits from Aunt Margaret's breast cancer charity galas for 4 years. The current balance is roughly $4 million. Complete, suffocating silence swallowed the room. In my previous life, I had discovered those documents while blindly organizing his basement archives, keeping my mouth shut out of pure fear. I was not afraid anymore. My parents left a trust fund, I continued, my voice sharp and precise. You drained it to pay for Victoria's equestrian lessons. I want it back. $13, 5,000 wired into a new account under my name by 8 tomorrow morning. In exchange, I walk out the front door and forget that offshore account exists. You're blackmailing me, Edward whispered, trembling with awe and absolute terror. I am negotiating, I corrected smoothly. A skill I learned by watching you. You have until 8. I went down to the basement and pulled my battered leather duffel bag from beneath the narrow cot. I packed only my shears, my drafting rulers, and the few clothes I had bought myself. I left the cheap navy dress hanging on the back of the door. At precisely Bezo Borninumfam p.m., my prepaid phone buzzed. A wire transfer of $13 $5,000 had successfully cleared. I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked up the stairs for the last time. Neither Edward nor Margaret came out to see me off. They were cowards hiding in their expensive ruins. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The iron gates stood wide open. I walked through them, clutching Adrian's business card in my pocket, and didn't look back. And that is exactly how you permanently burn a bridge and walk away with the match. Victoria thought she could step on my neck to reach the top, but she ended up suffocating in her own toxic entitlement. I used my second chance to take back what was mine, leaving them trapped in the wreckage of their own making.